All right. So this is for the last two objectives in the ecosystem's biodiversity. And one of the things that we haven't really done yet is define what biodiversity is. Okay, so biodiversity is a measure of the number of species in a given ecosystem. Okay, and you're going to have areas that are just inherently or just generally have more higher biodiversity. Okay, so places like the rainforest have much higher biodiversity than the desert. Okay, more organisms can live in the rainforest, more different species can adapt to the things that are going on in the rainforest. And so biodiversity is a good measure of kind of health. So that's another thing. Biodiversity is a good measurement for health of an ecosystem. Okay, the more biodiversity, the healthier the ecosystem. Okay, and so we have all of these different sorts of things where you have biodiversity and all that. But what biodiversity is also really good for, all right, higher biodiversity allows for ecosystems to be protected against disruptions. Okay, and when I say that, I mean, let's say you have an ecosystem. You have an ecosystem and it has 15 different species in it, okay? And there's a fire that comes through, and that fire wipes out 2 of those species in that ecosystem, okay? And then you also have a different ecosystem, and there are only 6 species, and the same fire comes through, and it rips up and tears through and kills 2 of the species within that population, okay? The organism or the ecosystem that has a higher number of species is affected less by loss of species, okay? So, higher number of species allows for loss to be absorbed by the ecosystem more easily. Okay, so the higher number of species we have, the better an ecosystem will do. Generally, these things, you can have all sorts of disruptions, whether it's people moving in, all of these different things can lead to a drop in biodiversity, but the higher it is originally, the better a place will be. All right, and so what we need to kind of look at here is the value of ecosystem or of biodiversity to humans. Okay, how do we measure biodiversity and its value? All right, well, what we're going to look at are these things called ecosystem services. Okay, and ecosystem services provide 3 different things. They're going to provide, 1, a direct economic value, indirect economic value, and then the final one, this one's a little bit harder to put, is going to be the, what's the word I'm looking for? I want to say altruistic or like spiritual, but it's more of like the aesthetic. value, okay? And we'll talk about those more here in a second. But does anybody have any questions about why biodiversity is good and useful and a good measure of these, all of this? Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Is anybody taking any notes, or am I good to erase this? Okay. So let's talk about these as direct, indirect, and then that aesthetic kind of spiritual whatever value. Okay, so number one, the direct value. Okay, so when biodiversity is higher and these ecosystem services, this is the how much money that an ecosystem and ecosystem and biodiversity can give humans. Okay, there's a couple different ways you can look at this. You can have things called ecotourism. Okay, so places where people want to go. So these are due to the ecosystems and nature. People pay to come and visit these locations. Okay, Montana has a lot of ecotourism. People come here to hunt, to fish, to go to the national parks. They come here to camp, backpack. All of those sorts of things are part of ecotourism. When these people come to Montana to do those things, they'll spend money at local businesses, which directly helps to the economy at a local level and a state level. So all of these things are ways that we can be affected. So when we have these direct ones, that is one example, is the ecotourism. Another is most of our medicine is found in wild plants. Okay, there's this flower that only occurs in Madagascar, and that flower is an essential treatment for, I believe, diabetes. And it just has natural properties that allow it to happen. I'd have to check exactly what it is, but I do know that this flower only happens to be found in Madagascar. So if we were to wipe that out, we'd essentially be losing this direct economic value, okay? And also you're gonna get some of your food sources can come from natural ecosystem services. Some people rely almost entirely on wild game in order to get sustainable food for the year. They talk about filling their fridges. That is another type of ecosystem service. So we have those sorts of things. The next one, and this is a little bit harder to look at, but these are the indirect values. Okay, and so some examples we have here are these things called mangrove trees. Okay, and so mangrove trees, these are found on the edges of bogs or swamps, okay? And they essentially hold the soil around the water together, okay? They also provide homes and habitat for many species of aquatic animals, okay? When you remove the mangrove trees, okay, when you remove these trees, they, the banks around the water begin to heavily erode, okay? So you're going to lose a bunch of the land right there. And that's why you see people who live near rivers. Have you ever seen when people put up big concrete slabs or put up like cars on the banks of rivers. That's to stop erosion, because when they moved in there, they took out all the trees along the river. The trees along the river, cottonwoods and things like that, their root system holds things together and stops erosion. When you remove these, you're essentially taking away this indirect value that allows the erosion not to happen. And it also allows for you to be able to live there and not have your land be taken away by natural water erosion. Another thing we can look at is wetlands. Okay, New York City actually was looking at, because it gets a lot of its drinking water from one river. Okay, they were going to build several water purification plants. Plants to help remove pollution from water. Okay, and they were looking at doing this in the river that feeds into their main water system. This was going to cost billions of dollars to make. Okay, and when they looked at how much that was going to cost, some environmental engineer came and said, well, one of the reasons our drinking water is so bad is because we have essentially destroyed all of these wetlands. And wetlands are a natural water filtration system. Okay, and so what they did instead, I believe they still built one of the purification plants, but instead of building the other ones, they added and restored wetlands upstream of NYC, of New York City. Okay, this natural process where they added back into it, they were able to save money on water filtration and purification, and they restored natural habitat. Okay, and so when they did this, there was that indirect value that we can't always see. We're not directly making money off of these wetlands, but they were saving money due to their water being purified naturally, and we were able to have a bunch of natural habitat being restored. Okay, so this was a win-win. People save money, water gets clean, natural habitat gets restored. Right? Are there any questions on these first two? So one is whether you're taking ecotourism and people are paying to see stuff, or you're getting medicine, or you're taking food like deer and elk and getting that immediate direct value. Or you have the indirect value where if you remove these things, you're going to end up paying for it in the long run, whether it's through the erosion of land or through the degradation or the essentially making your water worse. Okay? Any questions about those two? All right. And so this last one, this one's kind of hard to put into exact definition. But again, I'm just going to call it the aesthetic value. Okay? And this is basically the value that ecosystems, healthy ecosystems, have on human well-being. Okay? Well-being's two words. So this is going to be one of those things, and it's pretty apparent that they've done a lot of research that human mental health is improved when people have nature that they can observe. Okay, so this is one of those things, there's not necessarily a monetary value to the aesthetic value of an ecosystem, but it's it is one of those things that they've shown when people go out into the natural world, when they go out and observe what's going on. It's great for people's mental health. You feel better. It also allows for more recreation, okay? Which generally leads to the health of a population. Okay, if you have good ecosystems that people can hike in and view and look at, you're going to have a generally physically healthier population as well as a mentally healthier population. It just also, when you have the aesthetic value, it's something nicer to look at. This is one of the reasons that, again, people move to places like White Sulphur that are just generally prettier than they would move to Scobie or Culbertson. All right, you're not going to move to those places. They're just not generally as visually pleasing. And that's that kind of aesthetic value. Again, something hard to put a number on. But it's one of those things for me, and this, I mean, this affected me personally. I can speak to it. When I worked, before I worked in White Sulphur, I worked up in a town called Chester, and it was very much farming area, very, very flat. And there were a couple of mountains off in the distance that you could see. There are 3 mountains. They're called the Sweetgrass Hills. But me, I grew up on the other side of the Little Belt Mountains over here. And so I was just used to being able to see mountains and trees and all of these things. And it was one of those things where not having mountains, you wouldn't think that it would affect you as bad as it does, but especially when you grow up with it, you become accustomed to it. And it does have an effect on, you know, your mental health and your attitude and all of those sorts of things. And so moving here has definitely been a benefit to me in terms of all 3 of those things. I feel better and happier, and I can go outside and recreate more. I like to go out and fish. There's good fishing around here, all that sorts of stuff. So that kind of, those 3 things, the direct and indirect values are easier to explain, but the aesthetic value is just one of those things when you kind of look out onto nature and say, wow, that's really cool. I'm glad that I have that, and it makes you happier. It makes you healthier. I hope that, does that make sense to you guys, how I explain that? I hope that it does, because that's definitely the hardest of the 3 to understand. Sorry, Mariana.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. I'd like to make sure. And again, these are pretty much the last 2 checkpoints, is just why biodiversity is good for ecosystem health, and then why more biodiversity and these ecosystem services do benefit humans, why it's important for us to not just say, well, we can have this forest, or we can take it down and build a bunch of condos, and that'll probably make us more money. And in the long run, those removing of the forest and the adding of that stuff will probably hurt you more than it'll help you in the long run. It's hard for people to look at that sometimes. But anyway, if nobody has any questions, I will let you guys go ahead and